Thank you for being here. Hit it. Okay, can you tell? All right, cool. So my name is Jake Kapoor. I'll dig into my background and why this topic is super interesting to me in a second, but a couple disclaimers. There will be some charts and numbers, but I'll try to keep the math pretty light. It's a Friday afternoon, evening. I'll assume you know a little bit about startups in VC. You guys are here, so I'm assuming that you do. If you don't, grab a beer, meditate for a little bit. We'll all be better for it. And then lastly, most of this will sound right. Nick Hill told me that if anything is wrong, I should just say it with extra confidence, and then you guys will believe me. So that's the plan. Hit it. Dude, don't tweet during this. What are you doing? All right. Who am I? I'm the guy on the right. The Make-A-Wish kid next to me is Eli Manning, quarterback of the New York Giants. So I spent the first 5 years of my career in sports media and entertainment. Have spent a lot of time in and around the league world and with athletes, and this has become sort of a passion project of mine, understanding how athletes have gotten into the tech world and how tech and VC has started to get involved in the sports and media world. And then I'm wearing the garb of my people, the vest. I'm a VC at Launch Capital, invest in early stage companies, seed and Series A. So let's get right into it. So as you guys clearly know, there's been a ton of venture capital money that has flown in over the last decade, which has attracted the fascination, the attention of a ton of athletes. So whether it's Kevin Durant, it's the rest of the guys, and basically anybody who's on the Warriors is a VC right now. There's also a TV show that was started called MVP by my old boss with like Rob Gronkowski and a bunch of athletes to start getting them excited in like a Shark Tank meets sports kind of way. And so as you start to see that, and I'll talk about this over the course of the talk, that there's a lot of a mixture of celebrity, media, athletes, and venture capital happening. So let's go back in time a little bit and understand sort of how we've gotten to where we are today. What were athletes investing in before venture capital was this asset class that it is today? Mostly it was local, right? So you had car dealerships, you had restaurants, stuff that their local brand could actually affect. If you grew up in Jersey like I did, Brad Benson Hyundai was like on every corner of Route 1, right? So you've seen that. Shaq was getting involved in the 90s in a ton of like waterproof phones and different kinds of things. Don't feel bad for him. He actually ended up making a lot of money on the Google IPO. But mostly where athletes were putting their money before venture capital was Ponzi schemes. There's like literally stories littered with all these guys that would give their money to somebody, give them power of attorney, and then later realize that all of their money had absconded somewhere in the south of France. So. And that's to that point. There's very few guys historically that made a ton of money post-career. And so some examples, Magic Johnson really only made $22 million during his playing career, but turned that from retail deals and franchising in the 80s and 90s, turned that into $500 million. Junior Bridgman very similarly had 150 Wendy's franchises that he turned into a $600 million total net worth. And then my favorite is Arnold Palmer, who, genius of geniuses, realized that you could mix iced tea and lemonade and turn that into an $875 million total net worth before he passed away a couple of years ago. And for every one of these people that has made money, there's quite a few that lost money. And the combination of that would be people making bad investments, child support payments, that actually was a big one too. Some guy tried to start a shoe brand, but really he was just trying to pay off some gambling debts that he had. So these investments were really pretty shady. And the last stat that I found about, I think a year ago, was that nearly 17% of all NFL players that had retired had declared bankruptcy within 12 years of retirement. So let's stop there and actually talk really quickly. Most of these athletes will stop their playing career by the time they turn 30. And assume that these guys are going to live until they're 70 or 80. That means that you have made 80 to 90% of the money you're ever going to make by the time you turn 30. I'm turning 30 this year, that's scary as shit, right? And then you have to live for 50 years on everything that you've made. So you start to see why athletes wanted to get involved in either private investments or venture capital, because this is the skill set that they had. They made 90% of the money they're going to make, and now they got to live on it for the next 50 years. So this is where they are now, and this slide is designed to overwhelm you because there are so many athletes that are investing in tech and venture capital today. They're also investing in a lot of different things, so stocks and bonds, public markets, that's sort of a general thing that everybody is in, and athletes are too, but somewhere between 20 and 30% of their portfolio is usually 90% of what people talk about in the media today. They're going to talk about all of the new D2C brands that Carmelo Anthony is in, or they're going to talk about how Steve Young is in a bunch of enterprise software deals. That's the kind of stuff that people are actually excited to be talking about. And I wanted to go back and actually find a quote from an athlete to talk about why venture capital and why early stage tech is actually interesting to them. So Kelvin Beachum, who plays for the Jets and is a pretty active investor here in New York, his point was ultimately the goal is generational wealth. I think that is for anybody who really gets into building their own company or going into investing. But the thing that I really like that he said is the other goal is to see if your investment can make a significant impact. And so that's kind of the thing. You can make generational wealth doing buyout, private equity. You can make generational wealth doing real estate. But they want to see that the investments they're making actually have some kind of a significant impact. And so whether it's investing with a social purpose, which a lot of athletes do, whether it's investing in underrepresented founders, which a lot of athletes do, this is part of the reason why this asset class specifically has become really, really interesting to athletes. So you guys probably can guess what has changed over the last decade or so that has enabled this trend. The biggest thing is that live sports has become the only thing that sells on traditional media. So with the end of Game of Thrones, there is literally no scripted content that we all sit down and watch together, other than live sports, because there's still a spoiler alert at the end of live sports. So what's happened is that if you look at the four sort of major sources of revenue that U.S. sports teams have, media rights is the one that's going the biggest over the last decade. And as a result, what's happened is, I'm using the NFL where I used to work as an example, their deals happen on multi-year basis and they step up, let's say, every 5 years. So the clown that made this chart kind of kept it flat. This clown is changing that chart to say that, over the last decade, CBS, Fox, NBC, and ESPN have been the ones that have been bidding on NFL rights. Now, when those rights are coming up due in 2020 and 2021, you're not only going to have those four, but you're going to have Amazon, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, and all the different tech players trying to get into owning these rights as well. What that means is there's more money to go around. And that money has helped these athletes become richer over time. And so even adjusting for inflation, these contract values are going larger and larger. With the one exception of the NFL, which doesn't have guaranteed contracts, these other leagues are signing $100 million deals with their star players. They're signing $50 million deals with guys who played on star teams and then are going somewhere else now. And that money has to go somewhere. And generally that money has gone into helping these athletes build a brand. So they've gone on digital media. You've seen Juju Smith-Schuster, Drake, and Ninja play Fortnite. If those words mean nothing to you, I'm so sorry. And you've seen other folks that have built their own following with their fans on Instagram directly. And that's sort of the big change that's happening, is that you used to have to go into a select group of people to find deals. Now you can be on Twitter and you can be a VC. Like Nick Hill could be a VC tomorrow if we wanted. Like, God help us all. But it's possible, right? And so as a result, the democratization of all of this on social media has allowed these athletes to do a lot more with their money. And the other thing that's happened at the same time is going the other way. So now tech and VC has become celebrity. It's all over digital media. These athletes see it. They engage with investors when they're out in the Bay. If they play for the Warriors, all of their owners are VCs. And so it starts to become this virtuous cycle. All of these conferences in the last year have had panels on athletes investing. And so it starts to feed into itself, because athletes believe, hey, I can start investing in VC, and VCs start saying, hey, I kind of want an athlete invested in my company because it's going to help my brand, or they have some connections they can bring into it. And then the last piece of it is that these athletes, which are basically family offices, right? It's a single person who made their wealth that they're managing, have now turned into VC funds. And whether that means that they're grouping a bunch of their friends together to invest with them, or they're doing it on their own. You have different examples like Kevin Durant. He's investing across digital health, fintech, different brands. Derek Jeter launched the Players Tribune. He's also got some minority investments and stuff here in New York. Kobe Bryant raised $100 million, like 70 of it was his, and then 30 he got somewhere else. So you've seen this evolution of like family offices, which used to basically give their money to other people to invest, are now just becoming funds themselves. And it's not just the athletes. All family offices are actually going in this direction. And I'll explain a little bit of why. So I'll take a quick quiz. Who here knows where the term carry comes from? Hit it. What is it?
The whaling industry, I think, originally?
Close.
When you do math, you carry the number over to the next row.
Not that close. All right. So you can hit it. So it actually comes from the age of exploration in the 16th century. So carry used to be the carried interest. And that meant when you would send like Venetian or Portuguese merchants would go out to the Far East to pick up saffron and porcelain and gunpowder, they would bring that stuff back, and their expedition would be bankrolled by some rich Medici or other philanthropist who would fund that, and then they would come back with a bunch of things they brought back from the East, and they would get to keep 20% of the profit. So all of the 2 and 20 things you hear about VC and carried interest is 500 years old and hasn't changed, believe it or not. So I'm gonna try to keep the math a little bit light, but I wanted you guys to understand the difference between how a venture fund and an athlete operates. So for those of you that understand how a VC fund flows, this is boring, I'll go through it quickly. For those that don't, VCs actually operate unlike any sort of business, right? There's the operating business on the left side, where this is what's paying everybody's salaries. But then there's the other side where they go out to other folks, sometimes athletes, sometimes corporations, sometimes other endowments and pensions, to raise the money that they're going to take. They take a little bit of a management fee to keep the lights on every year, and then they get that 20% of the carried interest that comes back on the ship. Whereas athletes cut the middleman out because they are both the source of capital and they are the allocator of capital. And maybe they'll bring somebody on, but they're not going to give them 20%. The risk is a little bit less, so they keep 10%. So a lot of athletes got together and they said, hey, I'm making all this money, and I'm turning around, I'm handing it to Sequoia or KPCB or any of these other funds, and they're taking 20% of the profit on it. But I don't really need them to find deals. And I have my own brand, so I'm actually creating a lot of value for these investments. So I'm just gonna go do it myself. And I'll keep doing all the other stuff in the stocks and bonds and whatever I gotta do, but the little piece of the 20 or 30% of my net worth that goes into investing in startups, well, I'm gonna do that myself, or I'm gonna do that with the help of somebody to do it with me. And, all right, lastly, the one thing to think about is I've kept most of this academic, and I'll share a little bit of my thoughts now. It's really, really hard to make money in venture capital, and I think a lot of people smarter than me have said this, right? You will look at the distribution of companies that fail. 65% of companies don't return the initial capital they raise. Maybe 25% will return 1 to 5x. But if you're actually trying to return a fund, which I showed with my Bay Fred Wilson over here, right? He basically says in his portfolio, a third will do really well, a third will return flat, and a third will die. And so that means that, based on, let's say, 2 million that you put into the top, 2/3, you're trying to return 130 million on like 30 million invested, right? So what that curve on the side here, that power law curve shows, is that you really have to have breakout hits when you're investing out of a venture fund. But the question is, do athletes need that? Because athletes aren't investing on behalf of a venture fund. Athletes are actually investing just on behalf of themselves. And so this is where I'm a little bit torn in my exploration of this space, and I encourage you guys, if you're interested in this, to read more about it and see where athletes are putting their money. On one hand, these are really illiquid investments. And when you go back to the stats of all these athletes that are going insolvent within 10 years, these days, if you invest in a C-stage company, you're not going to see money for about 10 years. So if you're an athlete that ends up making some bad investments, that might be the end of the money that you need to live for 40 or 50 years. But at the same time, when you look at the faces of the people that I had on that slide, most of them are Black or Hispanic. There are women like the Williams sisters are actively investing. And this is capital that isn't flowing from VCs, but it's coming from these athletes. And so on one hand, I'm a little torn because I feel this is really risky, and just like the Ponzi schemes that athletes got into in the 90s, there are VC Ponzi schemes they might get stuck in today. But at the same time, there are a lot of founders and a lot of people that are seeing investment in their companies today that they wouldn't have seen if athletes weren't investing in venture capital. So that's my talk for today. I'm happy to answer any questions that you guys have, and follow me on the next thing. There you go. Follow me on Twitter for more of this fun stuff. All right, thank you.